So I'm James Coe, Senior Policy Advisor at the University of Liverpool.
And I'm Eli Saetnan, the Senior Academic Developer at the University of Liverpool, and you are listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Academy's Developing Practice podcast. In this episode, we chat with James Coe, a Senior Policy Advisor, and Dr. Eli Saetnan, a Senior Academic Developer, both from the University of Liverpool. We discuss the Student Success Framework and how it has been embedded across the institution. We also talked about the Pedagogic Research Conference coming up on the 19th of January 2022, which will focus on the same theme. We hope you enjoy.
James and Eli, we're really pleased to be speaking to you today. We're delighted to be hearing more about the Student Success Framework at the University of Liverpool and the upcoming Pedagogic Research Conference. But before we get started, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about your background and your roles at the university today. So James, if we start with you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm really excited to be here to talk about all things Student Success Framework. So I'm James, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the University of Liverpool, which means in the simplest terms, I spend my days thinking of what's the great things we should be doing in higher education policy and what are the bad things coming along that we should be avoiding. I prosecute that work in three ways. I advise the Vice Chancellor and her senior leadership team. I work on projects with a cross-institutional focus, and I engage with civic stakeholders and MPs. So that's my job in a nutshell.
Fantastic, thank you. And Eli, how about yourself?
Thanks for having us on. So I'm a Senior Academic Developer in the Academy. So my remit is to support academic colleagues across the institution to develop their practice in some way. So my kind of portfolio work is really diverse. I work with lots of different projects, teaching on our PGCAP, developing CPD events, establishing networks, but specifically relevant for today's podcast, I guess, is a couple of things. I'm working on setting up support and development materials for academic advisors, which is clearly tied into the Student Success Framework. And also I'm on the organising committee for the Pedagogic Research Conference, which is coming up in January. And again, we've chosen the Student Success Framework as the focus of that conference. So those are the two key things for today's session.
Brilliant. Thanks, both of you. Just before we get going, I just thought I'd quickly mention, James, I saw on LinkedIn that you have a book out at the moment. So I'd like to quickly ask you about your book, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And thanks for getting in before I shamelessly plugged it myself later on in the discussion. Yes, so my book, The New University, Local Solutions to a Global Crisis, came out last week. And it's interesting and linked to the Student Success Framework. And what I'm making the argument is universities did some amazing things during COVID around student support, how they invest their cash, basically how when we focus on some enormous social challenges, universities can genuinely change the world. And I am, naturally optimistic, but optimistic about the future of universities. So my argument in the book is if we capture that energy, if we capture the attention we paid to students' experiences and successes and take that into the future, will become an ever more important and indelible part of society. And I hope it, as ever with the first drafts of history, there will be bits that are wrong. But I hope it captures an enthusiasm at the moment when I think we have a chance to really make an even larger difference. But thanks for that, Matt. That was a very kind question to start off with.
I'm a very kind guy. I think that links really, really nicely, doesn't it? Because obviously the focus for our discussion today is the Student Success Framework. So just building on what you've just mentioned there about your book and about the framework, can you just go into a little bit of detail about what that framework is and how it came to be developed?
Yeah, of course I can. So, I'm assuming, Matt, Alex, Eli, that you went to university at some point in the past, and that's why you work here. But the reasons why people go to university, I think, are interesting, complicated, and aren't always clear when someone arrives at the door. So I went to university because I wanted to study a subject I cared about, but I also wanted to get a great job at the end. I wanted to meet people. I wanted to live in a city I'd not been to before. And what the Student Success Framework is it's a more realistic acknowledgement that although an academic experience is always going to be our core business, students' view of success is more complicated and multifaceted than that. And, I think we're all here because if we believe university is anything, It is a tacit promise between us and our students that their lives will be better by choosing to come here than if they choose not to. So what the Student Success Framework does is it looks at three elements of what it means to be a successful student. It looks at academic success and what that means in order to get a good degree and in order to thrive in the subject they do. It looks at personal success, which is about not only a student's happiness, well-being and sense of belonging, but having Liverpool graduates who feel like they can go out in the world and make a difference. And finally, it looks at future success, which is not only about getting a great job, but it's feeling like students have agency in deciding their own future. It is nothing less than an ambitious attempt to coalesce the resources we have across the university into prosecuting those aims. The idea is that when somebody reads it and picks it up, it is broad enough so they think, oh, in my team, this relates to some stuff I'm doing, but perhaps there's other ways I can use my resources. So to give you a couple of examples, I did a session with the employability team who were saying, we do loads of great employability stuff, but can we signpost towards sport in order to improve a student's personal success? I've done some work with other groups of staff, particularly out in faculties who are saying, oh, well, we understand good academic qualifications, but can we look at this for different student demographics using data we've got because these students have different needs? So it is simultaneously a starting point to have more nuanced conversations in our teams about how do we support student success. And it is an ambitious framework that says our students contain multitudes and our work should reflect that. And yeah, I think it's just a proper exciting way for us to start thinking about student success and genuinely lead the sector in it.
That's a really interesting point you just made there, James. We saw the student success framework in the academy. We saw that document and we were like, okay, how do we fit our bits into that? And then the light bulbs, switched on quite quickly. Because our purpose is to enable the university and the teams within the university to meet its purpose. So we're always sort of one step back. So when we see these sort of high level documents, and which are very focused towards student success, it can be sometimes difficult for those behind the scenes teams to apply their practice to it.
Yeah.
But I mean, for us, we could quickly see that. Have you found any teams who have said similar things?
I mean, it's such a good question, Matt. And the reason this is a framework and not a strategy is an acknowledgement that we're a university of people who work with students all the time, and people are aware of the problems in their areas and the best way to solve them. So rather than being a strategy and saying, look, here's a significant problem, in 10 years we'll go and do this, and then can you put the resource towards it? It should be broad enough for people to say, look, here's some broad objectives we've got. So that might be around degree attainment gaps. And then in your area, you'll know how to resolve it. So to give you another example, we recently launched the Student Success Innovation Fund, which provides funding to professional services teams, schools and faculties to close Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic student experience, award and outcomes gaps. And the reason we've done it that way is to say, look, as an institution, we can provide funding for programs. Your faculty or your professional services area can provide data analysis, but ultimately it's you who have the experience in working with those groups of students. So you use the funding on the way you think's best. And the result of that is we've ended up with an enormous range of programs, from things like business development schemes, multivariated analysis of different student demographics as relates to attainment. We've had a scheme to look at assessment methodologies and how they impact different groups of students. And for me, that is the power of the framework. And then what it says is there are some broad areas. We want your creativity to use the most of the institutional resource. And I think the example with the academy is the right one, Matt, where it's like we take a step back, we provide you with all the opportunities to succeed with this, but ultimately we respect your expertise as the people who work with students every day. And I think it's when you get that top and bottom relationship between institutions, faculty, schools, teachers, students, that we make the most effective change for the people who we're here to work for.
I guess my little corner of the academy, we've kind of had some interesting conversations around that, because our participants in our programs are also technically students, although they wouldn't necessarily see themselves as students. They're academic members of staff who are doing a postgraduate program in teaching. But it's kind of allowed us to open up some conversations with them about what they do with their students, but then seeing it from a student's perspective. That kind of weird, put yourself in your students' shoes. And it's been really interesting to see those conversations develop. And I think that framework has given us an additional lens through which to have those conversations, which has been really interesting. Yeah, we can talk about, what does success mean to you in this program? And like you say, our staff are just as multifaceted as our students are, and their motivations are just as diverse. So yeah, it's been really great to have those conversations.
I think that's such an interesting point, Ellie. And like, for me, I think the conversations between teams is where we see some of the greatest value as that starting point for staff members. And some of the issues that we're thinking about, it's like, what does a great employability offer for PhD students look like? And how does that link to student success? If we have postgraduates who are only with us for 1 year, how do we support really effective transitions into the university when we don't have them for as much time? How do you support the well-being of PhD students who are simultaneously both staff and students quite often and work across those areas? It's like, the conversations which we know are going on all over the place brought into a single area. And I think that's going to be a really, really useful tool for us. But yeah, there's loads of challenges. It's how we coalesce the activity together.
And Ellie, one of the key areas of your work, I believe, is with academic advisors, who are one group of staff who are really working hard to kind of embed this framework and support students to realise and achieve their own version of success. Can you tell us about some of the work that they're doing in terms of this kind of providing a unified vision of success for a diverse student body?
Yeah, it's a challenging one, that academic advisor role. As most academic advisors will tell you, they don't necessarily get given a lot of time and credit for that role, and yet it's a hugely important role for the success of the student. Having that one academic who actually cares about them and knows about them as an individual and their trajectory. So it's kind of building into those meetings between the advisor and the student, opening up those conversations. And I think this framework is a way of opening up those conversations, the kind of prompts for the questions you might ask the student to articulate in terms of their motivations, their kind of reasons for being here or where they want to go in the future. And I think you mentioned in the beginning, James, that students don't necessarily always know this themselves when they arrive. And the academic advisor kind of, some of them will say, I'm not qualified to give careers advice, or I'm not qualified to give personal advice, I'm just an academic. But it's not so much about giving the right advice or messages, it's about asking the right kinds of questions. And I think that's where this framework can open up for that. And so my role within this academic advisor, kind of what I would like to see is developing tools for academic advisors to have those conversations and giving them the confidence to have those conversations, and hopefully also push to give them the space and time to do so. That is the challenge.
If I could add two things to that, because I think that's sort of expectations piece from students and how you support academic advice too, I think is really important, because if you go from a school or a college, you're used to quite tight relationships, and the university is really different about what that looks like. And there's two things I always think about. So the Millennium Cohort Study, which tracked a demographically representative group of people born millennium about their hopes and ambitions, 97% of mothers, whether they went to university themselves, wanted their children to go to university. And on average, that same cohort spent 15 hours a week doing homework with their children in order for them to go into higher education. And I think ultimately, our success in supporting students through things like academic advisors is not only a personal success for those students, but is about a wider success of what the university sector is about. And I think it genuinely gives us such an exciting opportunity to lead the sector with the staff we've got, because ultimately our students love our staff. Our NSS demonstrates that again and again, our students like being here. And the trick is, how do we support them in order to support students better, which I think is a brilliant point. I think, and then the second part of why students here and why do they come? I mean, as I said at the start, so I started university 10 years ago this week, which feels like good timing in order to be doing this podcast. And I went here because I sort of picked the subject I was good at college. I liked Liverpool, and I had a vague idea I wanted to do something with English, and that was basically it. But what the Student Success Framework does is it gives students a tool to say, actually, here's a set of expectations the university set out. How can I work with my academics in order to achieve the aims there? So it's that reciprocal relationship that gives them a tool to, I suppose not hold us to account, but to be more active participants in their own success. And I think that's a really, really exciting opportunity.
Brilliant. So that sounds like a two-way document then. So I really like the thing that Eli just said about asking the right questions. It sounds to me as though the Student Success Framework could almost be used as for students to say, this is what we should be getting, and for the staff to say, are we doing this, and can I use this document to ask these questions of the student? Are we seeing that happening already?
I think we are to some extent, and I'm sure there are pockets of excellent practice across the institution, and there are pockets where maybe less of that happens. And I don't want to risk pointing fingers at anyone I shouldn't be pointing fingers at. So I think there's room to improve, but I think we are doing that in some ways, in different ways, in different institutions.
I think there's like a couple of practical bits to it. So one of the things I'd like to see colleagues use as the framework is to say, here's some broad expectations. Do we have the data in place that allows us in our school faculty professional service area to understand this? Are we providing sufficient support, advice, information to staff who are ultimately charged with delivering the ambitions of the framework? Have we put significant time aside in order to have those practical discussions of, okay, what does this mean to us? So it should be a useful starting point for some of those hygiene factors. And I think that other way around is really interesting because ultimately we can't support students as effective as we want unless we know it is what their ambitions are. And this is the whole point of it. So, if all of our students are coming in and saying, oh, I really want to go and work for the big four accountancy firms, that really changes our approach to, all of our students are overwhelmingly wanting to go and be PhDs. So it should be that another tool that gives the information insights to get the best of what our students want out of it. And ultimately, that's why we're here.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I really like is one of the key strands that are in the framework, which is the theme of personal success. And I think it actually says that all students will experience a welcoming and supportive environment which prioritizes well-being and belonging. So what are some of the things how we're achieving this at policy level, James?
There's a few bits. And I think, increasingly, I think well-being, sense of belonging, sort of happiness at universities is an area that's getting increasing attention. So, on a practical level, thinking about what does that welcoming part look like? We are talking the week after Welcome Week, where there's been a significant amount of activity going there to welcome students to Liverpool. I think particularly in the context of COVID-19, where students have, our second year students by and large might never have been on campus. That's a really unusual situation to be in for any cohort. So I think in the context of COVID-19, there's some really fundamental questions of how do you induct a cohort back into a new mode of learning? What does that look like? How do you provide support? Because ultimately, unlike any other cohort, their learning experience has been digital first rather than physically first. So they might have the same learning experience, but actually their sense of belonging to their cohort is very different. They've set up new relationships, maybe they're people in their halls or whatever. So I think it's a really important question there. I think secondly, they just haven't seen as much of us for very understandable reasons. By us, I mean staff, colleagues, etc. And for all the benefits of online, it is a very different way to do all the collaborative work that we think is valuable, whether that's developing pedagogy, whether that's those academic advisor relationships, which Eli's spoken about. So I think there's a really big question of how to do that. And I think thirdly, an area that is increasingly important and interesting is how do we support transitions for international students who, again, have had a really difficult time, whether it's quarantine, once coming to the UK, whether it's sort of that sense of isolation, more sense students have been at home. And how do we support transitions for PhD students who've been learning in very, very different circumstances, are coming onto campus and maybe doing some teaching? So I think you're completely right to raise it, Matt, as that sort of personal element. I think we're doing loads. I think, mental health support has never been more in demand, sort of those activities to welcome. As I walked on campus today, there's a new running track on campus, there is new basketball hoops, there's additional tennis tables. I know the Guild have loads planned. So there's loads going on. But I think of all the things that I think the framework should be doing is in the context of COVID-19, what do those personal relationships look like? Because I think that's what we've all missed with one another.
And I'm seeing that from working with academic colleagues as well, that the things they're interested in researching are exactly that, the relationship building, whether that was the experience over the past couple of years, moving online and how to develop relationships online, or like you said, the concern for how do we induct people back on campus now. So yeah, the staff as well are this is at the forefront of their mind of how we build those relationships.
And are you finding, Ellie, that things feel a bit different now to they did sort of in the height of COVID in terms of that relationship need for staff? Because I feel like people are going through peaks and troughs of I want to see everybody and I want to see nobody.
Yeah, a year ago, a lot of the conversations were around frustrations with blank screens and students not talking and how do we get them to engage with us. And I think people are now a bit sort of apprehensive about going back, but at the same time also really looking forward to having in-person conversations again and kind of being able to have that eye contact with students and making those real connections.
That's so interesting because when I look around the sector, I think one of the interesting things is all the people who can access resources who might have been excluded from before. So whether, it's because I have a disability, I'm physically getting to lectures and, getting there is very difficult, but having something that's recorded and I can watch back and, I can spend time over it, I think it's been a real boon for access. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a really interesting balance, particularly thinking of the personal success you mentioned, Matt, of how do you retain that element of contact, which I think is good for all of us, versus keeping the best of the elements of digital connectivity that have really, really benefited some people. And, it's a huge challenge for all of us. And it goes right to the heart of the pedagogical question of, I think there's some sense of, apprehensiveness about what hybrid learning means in the sector. But I think framing in a way of it's the best of the stuff that's gone before with the connection that we think is all important for our health would be a brilliant way to start conceptualizing what personal success could look like.
And that is the direction I see the people who are engaging in pedagogic research that I get to interact with. That's the direction they're going. Is last year it was about how do we make anything work online, and this year it's about how do we take the lessons from the last couple of years and keep the best. What was it that worked that we want to keep? So yeah, that's exactly the way it's going.
And particularly on that student transition point, I know I keep banging on about this, but I think it's really important. So we know that school children got the highest A-level grades ever, which, my sort of personal view is that given we had the fewest ever students drop out last year, according to student loan data, it suggests that teachers are doing a reasonable job of assessing their abilities. But one of the questions is, okay, well, if I think it was 49% of students got an A-star in A, that's fine to come in. But what if the bit I missed was like a stats module and I'm now studying economics? Like, even if I've got notionally an A or an A-star, how do we support students' academic success in that field? Or, that type of interaction I think is going to be really, really important.
You're right. Just talking to a friend earlier today, and her child's in that cohort that if they don't have A-levels this year, she will never have sat an exam when she goes to university. So it's that catch-up stuff, isn't it, of the statistics module that they've missed, or actually sitting in a hall and doing an exam, which is so important. So there is some work to be done around that.
And I'd be really interested if it exerts pressure on us to examine in different ways. It's really unusual. If I think about, the history of sort of examinations, you do it all broadly similar because what you get practice testing get better at better time. But when you've had a cohort that's not done exams for 2 years, is the best way to ensure their academic success by going back to a model that they are themselves unfamiliar with? I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but I suspect it'd be very different. And again, when I think about those conversations around the student success framework, I think a really good team conversation would be, what is it that students have missed that we can replicate and catch up on? What is it that isn't within our wheelhouse to do? But how can we replicate their skills by examining in different ways, by sort of understanding their abilities in different ways? And what have they gained as a benefit from 2 years of digital connectivity? Like, there can never be a cohort who has more digital skills than the one who's just come up because of everything they've been forced to do. And how do we turn that into a net benefit for their academic success rather than actually we're going to force you to do something else?
And it's already kind of, those looking back at what we've learned from the past year, one of those things is what are some different ways in which we assess the academic success of students? And, sitting in a room for 2 hours, writing down whatever's in your head, is maybe not the best way to assess someone's academic success. And I think this has been a real wake-up call for a lot of people. You've kind of done exams because that's what we've always done for the last 500 years, but there are other options, and the other options are actually working really well. And it's been interesting to see how it's pushed people to try new things that they would ever otherwise not have tried, and also pushed forward some of the aspects of our curriculum framework, such as authentic assessments. You know, sitting an exam is not an authentic form of assessment. So it's opened up those spaces a lot more, I think. And I'm quite, like, you know, you pushed your book in the beginning saying it's a really optimistic view of higher education. And I think hidden behind a lot of the uncertainty and the real stress that people have been under the last 2 years, I sense there's that little bit of optimism as well about we've seen that there's different ways of doing it, and that's given an impetus to actually do things differently going forward, not just going back to the same old.
I think so. And I think part of the reason why I feel optimistic about this is because it's given people an opportunity to demonstrate different skills. So, you know, when we think about this success question, it would be very easy to be like, well, success is we get this proportion of students get a first or a 2-1. Now, in a world where we know not everybody can get a first or 2-1, there are versions of academic success or personal success where it's like, oh, as a practitioner, I'm really good at providing digital skills and I can pass that on to my students. And that's suddenly become more important. And having students who are digital savvy are now at an advantage in where they were before. Or, you know, thinking about future skills, you know, the workplace of the future is going to look radically different because of experience of COVID. And again, the people who are skilled at remote working with teams from a distance, who are able to work independently as a result of their experiences here, will succeed. So I think it could totally flip some of the traditions and preconceptions that we've had.
I certainly wish that in my time it was all authentic assessment and not examination, because I used to fold like a pack of cards in exams and never did very well in examination. It was always the coursework was fine, but no, the examination, I always fell over with that. So if only I had my time again, but I'm not going to wish I was a teenager or a young adult in a pandemic. That's certainly not what I'm going to wish for, because they've had a rough ride, haven't they? Just touching back on that well-being again, can I just ask, because I think it must be quite easy to measure the sort of academic success, but how are we really going to measure the well-being success? Because obviously if we're measuring it in terms of, I don't know, students accessing services that we provide, then depending on how we look at that data, it could say, okay, well, you know, we've got an influx of students accessing mental health support. Is that proof that what we're doing is right, or is it actually proof that we've got more issues?
It's a good question. I'll go first and offer some, I suppose, broad reflections on it. So there's areas where we recognise, not just here but across the sector, there is underreporting of student wellbeing issues. So, for example, earlier this year we launched Report and Support, which is a tool that allows students to report complaints of harassment or discrimination through online form, both anonymously and whatever the opposite of not anonymously is, using their names. And they can do that. And I think we recognise and we know from research across the sector, things like racial harassment are underreported. So we would want to see an increase in those reports of harassment, and then over time so we can identify the trends and decrease it. Things like mental health reporting across, you know, the country, never mind the sector, are on the up. So you would want to see something which is contemporaneous with the issues that young people are facing. But going back to the point I was making earlier about digital accessibility, one of the things that we have found is people can access services at different times, more flexible times, and also throughout the year in ways that weren't possible before. Some of the other areas around wellbeing, I think, are slightly more difficult to measure. So we want more participation in sports, because all the research suggests that participating in sports and physical activity is good for wellbeing, it's good for employability, and things like if you get involved and become a team captain, it's good for your employability measures. So the things we're interested in is, you know, obviously the overall number, but are the people who weren't playing sports before deciding to take it up? And that would be another good measure of well-being. So, for example, I'm hopeless at nearly every single sport. I can't run, I can't kick, I can't throw, I can't catch, but I really enjoy it. So I think what's an interesting challenge to get someone like me to take part in a casual five-a-side team who otherwise wouldn't get picked for the first team versus the person who's coming here with athletic scholarship who's unbelievable at sport. They probably already have quite a good level of support. But how do we get the people who otherwise wouldn't experience those benefits to take part? And then the last one I'd touch on is that, part of this well-being question is a much wider one of how do we make the city and ultimately the country a vibrant, exciting place to live. So things like our commitment to sustainable development goals in itself is an expression of personal success, because without clean air, without, a country that's, a planet that's not going to implode in the next 100 years, it would all be a bit perfunctory. So it keeps a lot of different threads tied together with the aim of increasing participation for those who are least likely to.
I think I maybe also would kind of bring it back to something you said earlier, James, about how this is a broad framework, kind of, that you then look at individual practices or kind of local practices and how do we address that. And seeing as you got to promote one of your books, I'll just promote one of my papers, in that we just did a bit of a research study looking at how writing support for PhD students can alleviate some of the anxiety and stress that PhD students feel around thesis writing. And it was a very small scale, and it was using one of these survey questionnaires that has a standardized set of questions that has been developed not by me but by somebody far more clever to try and quantify level a sense of anxiety or stress specifically related to academic writing. And by having them complete that survey before attending some of these writing support sessions and again after, and seeing at least a little bit of a reduction in those measures, you can kind of go, okay, these sessions have an impact on that particular, aspect of being a graduate student. And you could do similar. It doesn't have to be exactly the same kind of study, but looking at those small scale local interventions and then seeing, do students report feeling better, less stressed, less anxious as a result of engaging with these. So I think there's kind of, yes, you can look at the big measures and the big numbers and the statistics, but it's also hearing from students on the ground and seeing those, even if just one student has been helped, that's a step forward.
I think that's such an amazing example because it just encapsulates that our students have lots of different needs and wants and what they want to do with their lives and things they need support with. That can only be resolved by local analysis, support by institutional accent. I think that's an amazing example of exactly what the framework can be used for.
So I guess it's examples like that, isn't it, that we need as we explore the impact of COVID and how the interventions have changed, and also the student success framework. And that brings us really nicely, Ellie, to the theme for this year's annual Pedagogic Research Conference, which is taking place on Thursday, the 19th of January, 2022, and it's online. And the whole theme for that conference is student success. So can you tell us a bit about that conference and how colleagues could get involved?
Yeah, so the conference is a pedagogic research conference. So it's a chance for colleagues who are engaged in some kind of pedagogic research to showcase their work. That's the intention, and to support that community of colleagues who are not just teaching, but are investigating teaching. So it's a fairly small conference. It's always very supportive, open to anyone, whether you are a really experienced pedagogic researcher or you're new to the game. This conference is for everyone. And we chose this year the focus of student success framework, but specifically that aspect of evaluating success. That was the idea for this conference, was to kind of encourage colleagues who are doing pedagogic research, who are exploring aspects of practice, to evidence whether that practice is having a benefit in some way, but within that framework of the student success framework. So we have visions of, but obviously people haven't submitted their abstract yet, so we don't know what actual topics will be there, but we kind of envisage there being presentations around evidencing interventions in teaching that improves academic success, evidencing interventions in terms of employability and showing how that improves students' future success, those kind of things. And we will have a keynote speaker to launch the conference. Who that keynote speaker is, I can't confirm just yet. But again, will be somebody speaking with experience of that evidencing success.
Wonderful. And I'm sure there's lots of ways that our colleagues can get involved, whether they're presenting their own research, even if that's in a very early form, or as a delegate to learn from others. Can you give us a rough idea in terms of kind of the timeframes of when people need to submit abstracts or sign up as a delegate?
Yep, so our plan is to launch the call for abstracts at the start of October, and they'll have until Christmas to submit those abstracts, or at least early December. That will open for either full presentations, which will be 15, 20 minutes presentations, and that's usually where is somebody who has a more advanced research project, some actual data to present and some conclusions. And then we'll open also for emerging ideas type presentations. Will be either a poster or a short video, and those emerging ideas presentations for anyone who has a starting idea for a project or some pilot data they want to share, and a chance to get some feedback and some input and kind of talk through ideas. Our ideas that those emerging ideas will be, so like I said, a poster or a short video, which will be made available ahead of the conference for people to engage with asynchronously, and then the full presentations will be live on the day. And hopefully lots of opportunities for people to find like-minded individuals and have really interesting conversations. That's the idea of the conference.
Brilliant.
Well, it's been wonderful to have some time with you and hear about the Student Success Framework. This podcast is the Develop in Practice podcast, and as a result of that, we like to finish each one in the same way, where our guests give us a couple of tips that listeners could reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. So if you do have a couple of thoughts or tips for people regarding this topic, what would they be?
Can I be greedy and give you 3?
Sure, absolutely.
So I think the power of the framework is ultimately that it provides a broad enough scope and a flexible enough application that teams can identify their own role within supporting academic, personal, and future success. So for me, I think the first tip is to get in your teams, whether that's your faculty, department, school, professional service area, to have a look and think, actually, how could this apply to what we're doing? And some of the questions to think about is, do we have the data now that allows us to understand what our students' view of personal future and academic success is? Do we have an insight in how we could coalesce our existing activity to be the more sum of its parts? And thirdly, are there teams we need to be in touch with? I think my second tip is to spend some time talking to the students you are working with and the type of thing that Guild will work with and facilitate. Ultimately, they are the arbiters and experts in their own success, and something we get involved in. And I think thirdly, that there is an opportunity post-COVID-19 to be ambitious about what we can achieve. We've sent down a really ambitious gauntlet at things like our access and participation plans that ultimately say we will have a more equal university, we will have greater outcomes for different groups of students, and we will support them to what they want to achieve, all made more difficult by COVID-19. So my last tip is in having these is that let's be ambitious about what we can achieve with our students, because they're certainly ambitious about what they want to achieve when they're with us. If I give a fourth one, that would be to go out and buy my book, but I think that would be too shameless. So I will leave it there.
Ellie?
I guess I would kind of shift the focus from that big framework down to kind of your personal practice in reflecting on what does success look like or feel like to yourself and your students, but then how do you evidence whether you're achieving that success? So and then once you have a plan for how to collect that evidence, submit an abstract to the conference or come along to the conference and listen to what the ways in which other people are trying to evidence good practice and how we achieve that success.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time today, guys. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to James and Ellie about the Student Success Framework.
I like what James was saying about how students want more from their university experience than just an academic qualification. That very much chimes with my experience of working with students. He mentioned how students are also really interested in their personal success. So how can we develop those skills in them and support them to develop those skills that will make a difference in their lives and in the world? And also students are really interested in their future success as well. So supporting students' agency on how they can develop and impact their futures. This is all being built into the student success framework, which gives that kind of broad overview of the student experience. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. It's really good to have that framework in place, isn't it? So we can focus more holistically on these things for students. Eli then also talked about equipping colleagues to not particularly have all the answers for regarding student success, but instead to equip colleagues to have those sort of conversations so they can ask the right questions. And I think that's really, really important as well. And then the students can go off and explore and agree a pattern of their own student success that is specific to their own individual circumstances. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you'd like to take your thinking further, we've added some resources to the website on a specific podcast reading list, which you can access at liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. So please do check those out. It'd also be great if you let us know what you thought about the episode. You can tweet us at LiveUniAcademy, and you can also find us at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen on Twitter.
And we're really grateful for those who have taken the time to either rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app. So if you are an Apple user, please do take the time to review our show, as it will help others find us. Bye for now.